Good morning to everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to come and spend about 30 minutes with us just chatting about Dare to Lead work and what is happening currently in this crazy time that we're in. It would have been great if we had had the opportunity to have the Dare to Lead program before this pandemic started, but as it happened, things didn't work out that way. But there's so many lessons in the Dare to Lead work that are applicable in just a myriad of ways. Every day I either get questions or calls, or I'm on webinars or virtual meetings with people talking about all the different aspects of this work that are so relevant today. So I'd like to just open the floor up. Anybody who has an issue or a question that you want to ask, go ahead and start typing it in there. But one of the things that for me personally has really hit home is this overwhelming feeling of insecurity and shame, kind of surrounding the lack of control that I have over my own life or my own house or where I go and what I do. And so I would be interested to find out, does anybody else kind of have that struggle right now, that you are in this spiral of feeling out of control? Yeah.
Hi, it's Ann Hall.
Hi.
I think what I think many people are experiencing is the anxiety over planning. We're trying to plan for the fall, we're trying to plan for the spring, we have speakers, and you can't really dig your heels in and get something done. It's all still up in the air, and that creates so much anxiety. So yeah, I'm there.
It's interesting because one of the barriers to courage that's laid out in the Dare to Lead work is action bias. And that's where we want something to happen. We want it to be fixed now. And it's uncomfortable sitting in that problem solving and problem identification phase. And unfortunately, we are in a problem identification phase and a problem solving phase that's kind of not allowing us to even begin to move forward with that. And so this idea that I want it to go back to normal, I just want things to be as they were, I don't think that we will ever go back to what we consider normal. I think that we have to move forward in that normalcy. You know, it's not going to look like what it did before, unfortunately. And I think we're going to have to sit in this weird problem solving phase for quite a long time. And I think it's just going to be continual as far as being flexible and not allowing our emotions to overtake us. I certainly feel that anxiety about not being able to fix something, not being able to have the answers, or to go back and just have things as they were. You know, I would actually say that in a lot of instances, there are a whole lot of things that we might not want to even go back to. But what happens with us is that we get comfortable. And so even if a situation is not a great situation, or there are things that we could have fixed or should have fixed, it is more comfortable for us to go where we are familiar than to step into those uncharted waters of change and doing new things. I'm just gonna read real quickly in here in the chat because it's hard for me to talk and read at the same time, but let's see. Some differences in how we perceive our current world. That makes sense. Just checking in with yourself and allowing yourself to acknowledge the insecurity. Yeah, absolutely. Acknowledging it, just sitting with it, because everybody is in that insecure spot. Definitely. I don't think anybody feels grounded during this particular time. It's interesting. Been doing a lot of work with different teams around what the virtual world looks like. what we used to perceive that it looked like, what is the reality of where we are, and what that all means. So I'm just going to throw something out there. Not everybody right now has their camera on, and that is perfectly okay. But here's what happens. In the absence of data, we make up stories, okay? And so in a virtual setting like this, where we have people who are some on camera, some are not, the absence of data sometimes can be the absence of actually physically seeing who is on the other end of that line. And I have had multiple conversations with leaders in companies that kind of don't know what to do with that. And so what is happening is they are making assumptions as to why people are not turning their camera on. Some of the assumptions range from, well, they're not paying attention, they're not really on board, you know, they're just not engaged. And no, you don't have to turn yours on. I'm not saying that. I promise. That's not what I'm saying. What I do want to say is that the reality of it is that never before, I have no makeup on. And listen, I've got gray hair, so it's totally okay. The reality of it is that for so many of us, our home is our private, personal space, okay? And usually we have friends at work. Maybe we've got a couple of friends at work that we let into kind of our private space, our private world. But all of a sudden, when you have gone to nothing but virtual, all of a sudden your company has access to your private space, your boss has access to your private space, your coworkers have access to your private space. And those are people that I probably would have never, ever even invited into my home. Some of them I don't probably even like. But, you know, the reality is that I think it would be proper for us to ask permission to enter someone's home. You know, if we go to somebody's house physically, we knock on the door, we don't just barge right in. And this virtual setting is a little bit like that we are just assuming that it's okay to come into people's homes. And that's not necessarily something that's true. What are some of the things that would keep you from turning your camera on? I know we've seen a lot of things like this, but are there some other things or other reasons?
A lot of times there's technical issues. I mean, aside from the fact I have my camera off because you literally do not want to see me. This is Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay.
But I was going to say sometimes it's literally just something as simple as technical issues. It's grainy, or it reduces your sound quality, or whatever else. But I think what you bring up is really interesting, because I found like the biggest challenge for me is that I didn't realize how much I relied on, and I've shared this with a couple people that are on this group, but how much I relied on nonverbal communication and nonverbal cues to get my information that I use every day. And in order to make decisions, and in order to, and a lot of it is just a feeling or a hunch based on people's body language. And when you're working through email only, or you can't pop into someone's office and ask, how do you feel about this, or whatever, I really felt like for the first few weeks, especially, I was flying blind. Like I had lost an extra sense, you know, that and I work in primarily communication. So it's really difficult. It was difficult for me to make decisions about how to communicate without getting all the input.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I completely agree. I'm following this chat as people are putting things in, and what strikes me about this is that there is a lot of unspoken shame in what we're putting down. I don't have my makeup on. I'm in my pajamas. It's going to be loud and distracting. I've got kids, or I've got pets. And none of those things are things that we need to feel shame over or be ashamed of. The reality is we are at home. And if we have kids at home, what are you supposed to do with them? It's not like you can go lock them in a room and say, oh, mommy's got to go to a meeting. For those of you who have little kids, you know that if they are quiet for 5 minutes, you better be checking to see what's happening. I mean, it's this idea that we are so worried that we are being judged. Does anybody feel that way? That you're feeling judged? Yeah.
You know, Leah, it's funny because if before this pandemic happened, if you'd asked me, you know, about communicating through a screen all the time, I would say that there is nothing less vulnerable than communicating with someone through a screen. But
so
this is kind of not playing out like that, because we are inviting people into sometimes the chaos of our homes with pets and kids and things like that. It actually is pretty vulnerable.
I think it is one of the most vulnerable situations we can put into place when we allow somebody to see our life, our personal life. There's long been held this management philosophy that you've got to separate your personal life and your home life. And I really think that generationally that is beginning to flip, you know, as more and more younger Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Zers move into the workplace. They're saying, you know, there's not going to be this separation between my family and my work. If you make me choose, I'm going to choose my family. And so I think we've been seeing that trend anyway, but there still has been this stigma of your personal life is private and what happens at work stays at work. So bringing somebody into your home to see how you live, to see what happens, is probably one of the most vulnerable feelings of being completely and totally exposed. Or as Brene would say, that is walking full on into the arena. And if you are worried about that private space, if you already have, hello there. See, that is a prime example. There are people who would freak out about their cat coming into the picture. And you know what? That is the reality of it. It's no secret we're at home. Pets come in, they make noise. Kids come in, they make noise. And so if we could walk away with nothing else today, I would like to tell everybody that don't have shame about your home, where you live, how you choose to live. That is okay. And this idea of self-compassion that we talk about in the Dare to Lead program, we cannot give what we don't give to we can't give to others what we don't give to ourselves. And yet I think we've been walking kind of that fine tightrope of giving as much as we can, but this is the time that we absolutely have to give ourselves that break. Think about this for a minute, you know, talking socioeconomically, one of the barriers to courage that Brene talks about in Dare to Lead is that this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we don't really talk about the privilege that we have in so many circumstances. And I think this virtual world has really brought that into the forefront, because there are so many people out there who maybe, if they're lucky, they've got one computer in the house. So how do you manage, right? What more privilege do we have if we have more than one way to actually get in and communicate and do our work? But what happens if you're the family that has one computer and you've got two adults that are both trying to work from home, and you've got kids who need to do their schoolwork? How do you prioritize who gets the computer and who gets to do the work? Do you prioritize it by who makes the most money? They get the computer because theirs is the most important. Or how do you tell your kids, I'm sorry, you can't do your schoolwork because I've got a project due or I'm supposed to be on a call? I'd be interested in the chat, or if somebody wants to come off mute, what are your thoughts about that? Yeah, it'd be very tough. This is that time when the philosophy of being generous with our assumptions truly would come into play, and getting curious about what people's reality really is.
I'm currently, and I know some other people in this chat are too, are doing a train the trainer for implicit bias training at the University of Louisville. And, there's a lot of conversation revolving around privilege and how much this COVID-19 experience has really put a lot of that to the forefront. My partner and I were talking last night about how JCPS is dealing with families that have 7 children and 1 borrowed Chromebook. And how do you do this non-traditional education when you have children under those circumstances? It's even the meals that they're offering. We pick them up for our kids just because it makes life easier. But I look at that and I think, how does an 18-year-old man eat this? And this is the food they're getting. Like, it's not, I can supplement, but another family might not. And so there is a lot of equity questions that come through that just makes this more blaringly apparent and more just visually pronounced when you're going through this, whether it's through elementary education, the P-12 education system, whether it's what your college students are dealing with whether they have access at home, whether they have the suitable technology to do what they have at home, to what you've mentioned of what we're dealing with in the workplace, and how do you tier all that and triage all that when you're in your work and professional environment.
Yeah, it is absolutely so true. One of the comments that just came through is, I feel guilty even complaining about the struggles that I'm having. That's a totally separate issue that we call comparative suffering, that somehow we rank our suffering, and some suffering is worse than others. And granted, there's a whole lot of things that are way worse than not having one computer at the house. You can't necessarily compare people who are dying or people who don't have enough food to eat with the suffering that we may be going through and being uncomfortable. However, when we talk about comparative suffering, many times the feeling and the emotion that go along with that are the same thing. And that is what being empathetic is all about. Is it saying, I don't necessarily have to have the same experience that you have, but the feeling that I get gives me the same feeling. And so therefore I can be empathetic with you, and I can feel with you, and I can be there and hold space with you. So it's just, there's so much that we can't even begin to scratch the surface of all the emotions and the things that people are feeling out there. How do you rank order what you're going through versus what somebody else is going through? Am I the only one that has trouble doing that? Because I've got a 94-year-old grandmother in Arkansas that I can't go visit because it would be unsafe, but somebody else just lost their grandmother. The reality is those are 2 completely separate incidences, but we're both feeling the same emotion of grief, right? And so I would challenge you to look at whatever scenario or situation or environment that you are in, and instead of looking at the actual event, figure out how that event makes you feel, and utilize that to be empathetic with your coworkers, with your friends and your family. I love that commonality versus comparison. I love this idea of commonality, especially when it comes to shame triggers, because we've already all shown in this chat that we all have a lot of those same shame triggers. There are gender shame triggers, there are race shame triggers, there are religion shame triggers. And what happens is that feeling of shame comes from the same place on the inside. It's that traumatic area of your brain that registers trauma, and it makes that feeling of shame, kind of that warm wash pit in your stomach, that makes you feel that. Sharon asked if I can give an example of a shame trigger. Yeah, for me, I am a people pleaser. And so when things happen, a lot of times where I will go is that, oh, well, they don't like me anymore, or I didn't do the right thing. Here's a prime example. The other day, I was doing a webinar for a company, and we had a 30-minute time block. And so I had prepared everything, literally timed it out pretty much right to the 30-minute mark. What I didn't realize is that we were going to have 5 minutes on the front end of that. And so I really needed to get it done in 25 minutes. And so at that 30-minute mark, I get a chat, a private chat during this webinar saying, we're going over, we're 5 minutes over. And I could just feel that wash of, God, Leah, you're such a screw up. Could you not even time it right? Did you not pay attention? And that's what shame triggers can be. It makes you feel like you're not good enough. It makes you feel like, who do you think you are? Another example, for me in particular, just to give you a little kind of background on me, I'm 52 and I'm married for the second time. My first marriage, we got married our senior year in college, and my husband was an Army officer. And so for 25 years, he and I traveled around the world with the military and had our family. And, you know, I graduated in '89. And so as a career military officer spouse, I didn't necessarily need to go back to school and get my master's degree. And so I worked and I trained and I taught and did all these kinds of things. I was very functional with my bachelor's degree. Coming out of a marriage at 46 and not having a master's degree, all of a sudden I had this wash of shame of, oh my gosh, you can't even compete with the 22-year-olds that are coming out with their master's degrees, right? Yes, it's very similar to that imposter syndrome. And so I really had to work through that shame trigger of saying, you know, this is my life experience. This is my lived experience. I'm qualified to do things because of my life and my experience, and it doesn't have to be the same thing as somebody else. And so just about the time that I really feel like I am getting to that place of being worthy, of being qualified, of having credentials enough to say, here's what I do, I had somebody that I was working with ask me about a particular financial situation. And I gave my opinion and I said, you know, I don't think that this is maybe going to go in the direction you are hoping that it's going to go based upon my experience. I think you need to watch out for this, this, and this. And on the other end of the line, they said, you know, thanks for your opinion, but I've run the numbers. I've got my master's degree, so I think I know what's going to happen. And I was like, total shutdown, complete and total shutdown. Now, if I were a person who went back and said, I told you so, I'd love to pick up the phone and say, you know what happened 6 months later that I said was going to happen? It really happened. But I'm not the person to do that. I would like to, though. And just sometimes I take my struggles out on my friend Darla. This is Darla, my dang it doll. And she and I have had a lot of conversations over the past 2 months. Like, I'm so frustrated. I'm so mad about the way that things are going. But so those are some ideas of shame triggers. Absolutely. Age can be a shame trigger. Whew. There is nothing like, here's another example for you. So as I was coming out of the divorce, this was back in 2016, I was looking for a job and I had applied and applied and applied. And I'd applied for this one job that I thought, okay, I'm really qualified to do this. And so I was out to dinner one evening, and our young waiter that we had every time we go to this restaurant came up and he said, "Hey, it's my last night here." And so we were congratulating him. "That's wonderful. What are you going to be doing?" He said, "Well, I've been hired on at XYZ company to do ABC." And it was the exact job that I had applied for, and I didn't even get a call back. 25 years of experience, twice his age, and didn't even get a call. So age is a trigger, experience can be a trigger, appearance is a huge trigger. There are different triggers for women and men. Some of the triggers that I see very often in men are the need to be the breadwinner, the need to always be strong, to be the hero, to be in control, to be able to take care. And when anything, kind of goes against that or scratches that surface, that is a huge shame trigger. And what Brene says through her research about men and women, men's shame triggers in particular, is that men's response in many cases to whatever triggers them is either pissed off or shut down. And I totally can look back through my whole entire life, through every man, boy that I've been close to, and that is pretty typical about how I see things, pissed off or shut down. For women, the way we respond is a couple of ways. One, we get small, we get quiet, we don't push back. Or two, we become bitchy, right? And so we try to push and push. So just those are some ideas of shame triggers. We've got about 3 minutes left. I didn't want to take too much time. Virginia, I see you doing this.
I would love to know, Leah, I know you have been in meetings very recently with Brene Brown and this army of instructors and facilitators that she's building to spread the word. Could you give us, as we near our time, could you give us a sense of how she's viewing our current challenges and what is top of mind for her during this time?
Obviously, I cannot speak for her, but I will tell you what my perception of that has been. Now more than ever, we need to be very mindful of what is putting us into that shame place. And we need to understand what our emotions are. You know, the antidote to shame is empathy. And so many of us are feeling shame over lost jobs, over lost loved ones, over things we're out of control of. And so being able to identify what is the feeling that goes along with that and being empathetic to it. Definitely kind of being generous with our assumptions and assuming that people are doing the very best they can. There's this idea out there that she talks about, I believe it's in Braving the Wilderness, but don't quote me on that. But what she talks about is this idea that instead of having genuine connection with people, that when we don't have genuine connection, sometimes we can connect over a common enemy. And certainly in the first few weeks, maybe even the first month of COVID-19, I think as a country, we really began to connect around a common enemy, and that was COVID-19. But now what we're seeing happen is that as we begin to reopen, as people get antsy and nervous and they're ready to get back to normal, we're seeing people unite around a common enemy that happens to be somebody who doesn't believe what they believe. And so instead of fighting together to fix something, we are fighting against each other, because if you believe like I believe, then that must mean we're connected. It's not a real connection, but I think that's something that is really top of mind to be aware of, that stressful times can bring out the best in us. It can bring out the worst in us. And hopefully we can walk away from this and understand more about what other people go through. There's a Dale Carnegie one of his principles is try to see things from the other person's point of view. And I think that that really is a message that Brene has taught and has preached, and is so true in this time, is that now more than ever, we have to see things from the other person's point of view and be able and willing to hold space for those uncomfortable spots that we may not have an answer for. So with that, thank you all so very much for joining. We have a couple of 2-day programs that are on the books right now. If you want to immerse yourself in the full program, I believe the first one coming up is June 24 and 25. We have one coming up in July. And then the keynote has been rescheduled for August 25th. So thank you so very much. I appreciate your time. Don't hesitate to reach out. And if you have any questions about how to bring the program in, please contact the College of Business, and they will hook us all up together. So with that, thank you guys so very much. I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes in case anybody wants to talk or you have other comments. So I'll just kind of hang on for a few minutes. But thank you for your time today. Have a great day.